Good morning and welcome to Taft. My name is Chris Henneman and my wife, Jane, in the second row. We're both excited to be back on campus for a record-breaking weekend attendance to lead this year's Parents Fund Committee as co-chairs. This is our 8th consecutive year at Taft as parents. We didn't go here, but we are parents. Our current son, Patrick, he is a current upper mid, and we have 2 graduates, Henry and Emma. We are honored to be following in the footsteps of former co-chairs Chad and Neely Messer, who did an amazing job shepherding the committee through the pandemic years and achieving another pair of 90+% participation goals, a very high bar for Jane and I and the rest of you. Jane and I take over as co-chairs at a very important and historic time at Taft, as Willy and Pam, with a combined 65 years of extraordinary service to the school, have announced they'll be moving on at the end of the school year. Every year, the Parents Fund is a critical source of funding supplementing the Taft Fund to support the school's nearly $50 million operating budget, which cannot stand on tuition alone. Gifts to the Parents Fund directly impact Taft's ability to recruit and retain the highest caliber faculty and coaches, provide an incredible array of academic and extracurricular programming, and attract the best student body possible and keep Taft a dynamic and diverse community. Taft's annual support comes from 3 important sources: current parents, former parents and grandparents, and alumni. Participation continues to be the hallmark of the Parents Fund's success. Parent support at Taft not only enhances the lives of each student in a direct and immediate way, but is also one of the school's most impressive credentials. For 30 years, Taft has maintained a 90+ parent participation rate. And last year, 91% of Taft parents joined in raising more than $2.7 million, representing 45% of total Taft funding. This ringing endorsement of the parent body has become Taft's trademark and is a critical factor in enabling the school to compete on every level with the most highly endowed schools in the country. The Parents Committee is comprised of 60 families who volunteer their time to educate parents and encourage your participation in the Parents Fund. Our goal is to make sure that the tradition continues through these transitory years and continue to provide for one of the best boarding school experiences in the United States. Your support ensures that Taft's education remains a great value, so when you are contacted by a Parents Committee volunteer, please be responsive. Thank you for your time today in advance of supporting the Parents Fund this year. And with honor and pleasure, I introduce the head of our school for his last fall President's Address, Willy McMullen.
Thank you, Chris and Jane, for the work you do, and I really, in advance, thank you for supporting the school. It's so important, and we're also lucky to be at a place where parents over the years have built this tradition. So I hope you will contribute. We need you, and not that I'm competitive, but it's better than any other school out there, including our arch rival. So. Thank you for all you do. I want to talk today I want to speak both personally and institutionally, and thought a lot about giving this address. The title of it is Touch and Light, the Work of a School. And I want to help you understand the school and what we try to do here. And that means I'm going to speak quite personally, and perhaps that's maybe the inevitable place for me to begin this year. And you should know that 2 decades ago when I began, I gave an address to the faculty, and I spoke about 2 of the most important influences on my life as an educator, and they were my mother and father. And so it seems fitting that I come back to that moment and to them, because indirectly, but as powerfully as if it were genetic inheritance, they have shaped this school. And so I think to understand Taft, if you want to know this place that you've seen today, you need to know my mother, who showed me that a great school touches, and my father, who showed me that a great school enlightens. So touch and light is the theme today. Now, way back in the summer of 2001, when I was appointed head, I was attending a conference in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and I found myself out driving for coffee. And as I turned a bend, I came upon the sign, Wellesley College. And it was there that my mother had attended. And I pulled over, the car idling, and I just gazed up the driveway. And while I wrote about that day later, my memories are blurred, indeed, as often our best memories are. I felt that if I stared any harder, I would surely see her walking up the pathways on her way to history class, perhaps as a 20-year-old. And I recall feeling that I was on some kind of pilgrimage, as if I was arriving at the gates. There were banners hanging off of the lampposts. There was something oddly medieval about the place. I half expected the blare of trumpets. And someone pointed me to the alumni house. You go through an arch up the stairs, and you'll feel as if you're entering a castle. And it did. And I walked under this arch, and it was dark and cool, and the steps were cupped by the century of women who had been walking there. And I found myself walking through a bowered courtyard across this verdant arc of lawn underneath a single towering tree. And then I was suddenly upstairs near an office where a wonderful secretary said, "Can I help you?" She might have asked, "Why have you come?" and pointed to a sword and a stone. And then she handed me the 1951 yearbook. She turned her back to the computer and I to flipping the pages, and suddenly I saw my mother. On the left page, smiling with 3 friends. And then on the next page, her portrait. And I sat there barely breathing. The book rested on my knees, and I had found my mother. I've never forgotten that moment. Now, my mother, who is no longer alive, was born to teach. She grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, the youngest of 3 daughters. She was very bright and fiercely disciplined and intellectually bold, and she threw herself into schoolwork and did well. She came east to Wellesley, and in the next few decades got a master's from Harvard, a PhD from Columbia, helped raise 4 children. For 30 years was the head of the teacher preparation program at Yale, was a guest lecturer at Brown, author of a book, and served on a variety of schools and civic boards. But in all that, it was in her role as the director of teacher preparation at Yale that she truly found her calling. And under her, and I say with obvious love and bias, Yale developed perhaps the finest educational program in the nation. And there she became a mentor of extraordinary influence. She taught hundreds of students how to teach, and over my years, I've lost track of how many times I've attended a conference to have someone see the name tag and say, "Your mother changed my life," or received an email from a long-lost Yaley asking for her phone number or address, usually with a PS along the lines of, "You know, she was the most important mentor I've ever had." And so to this day, the phrase, "Oh, you must be Edie's son," is one of the finest compliments I can get. And on their collegiate journey at Yale, students came to her in a steady stream, pilgrims and migrants alike, finding in her office the place where mentor and therapist and mother somehow meet. She kept office hours that would shame anyone. She advised more senior essays than anyone on campus. Her table next to the desk had a box of Kleenex, cookies, and tea. The wall was covered with postcards from former students. When her students would come by, and they hung out for hours. When her methods class was over-enrolled, rather than lottery out half the students, which was what everyone else did, she simply decided she would teach another section. So to her, and we come back to this idea, to her, touching students in an intentional way, that is, empathic caring, total investment, unflagging support, that was a job requirement for the teacher. And she believed that teaching was a vocation that was nearly sacred in its power and possibility, and she protected it like the priesthood. The glib, the shallow, the uncommitted, they were driven off from the career by a kind of fierce Doberman protectiveness. Schools now needed great teachers. This was not the time for dabbling. Here's a story of her. Some of you may have heard of the KIPP schools, Knowledge is Power program schools. These were founded in 1994 with a single school in Houston. And I would argue that the KIPP school network is one of the most outrageously successful educational entrepreneurships in the nation. It's now a collection of about 250 schools that serve inner city youth. KIPP was co-founded by a man named David Levin, and he was an advisee of my mother's. And this book, this was a New York Times bestseller that came out a number of years ago. By the way, highly recommend it. It's called Work Hard, Be Nice: How 2 Inspired Teachers Created the Most Promising Schools in America. So it's absolutely a fantastic book. And on page 50 of the book, you find a small exchange involving this outrageously smart and idealistic and ambitious student and a tough and loving professor. Author J. Matthews writes, again, on this page, Levin's academic advisor was Edie McMullen, also the director of teacher preparation at Yale. Levin didn't want to take any teacher training classes. He thought the methodology units would be deadly. But his fascination with the education of low-income minority children persisted. So he submitted proposals to 2 foundations. He reached the finals in both competitions, but he was told that his project was too unrealistic. McMullen said she was glad he wasn't selected. Quote, "You don't know enough to be a big policy planner. Go teach." And it's a voice I recognize, and a voice, by the way, that terrified me at times. A few months later, he was teaching for Teach for America, and then he and his colleague Mike Feinberg would open their first KIPP school 3 years after that. And when David Levin, who also spoke here at one point and addressed the faculty, when he heard of her death, he texted, "She was a force of nature. She was indeed tough and loving and no nonsense, but she believed in me and she cheered me on every step of the way. Her faith gave me the strength through so many hard times." Now, these are the words of one of the nation's leading educational voices, an absolutely brilliant innovator and visionary, a man who's received all kinds of awards. And it sounds like she got to him. She touched him. So in her 3 decades of nurturing and challenging TAF students, my mother never lost that passion for contact. It wasn't very complicated. She would say often, "That's why we teach." And her beliefs, and let me be clear, her life, not just her belief, her entire life, fundamentally shaped my philosophy of education. And that in turn has shaped much of what the school is. So what does it mean for us? What does it mean to say teaching is touching? It means first that a school like us, you must look for teachers for whom connecting with and caring for students is as natural and necessary as breathing. I look for that when we hire teachers. It means that we see potential for connection at every hour of the day and on every corner of the campus, and indeed think that sometimes those most surprising and unexpected ones are most potent. It means in a day when students live in and curate themselves online, when the pandemic left a generation quarantined alone, when adolescent mental health is frayed, we have to touch more emphatically than ever. It means that we have to bring a tough demand that they will meet high expectations, a stubborn faith that they can succeed, and a tenacious insistence that we will be in their lives. So what it means is faculty will walk into dorms at night, dropping by rooms and sitting in common rooms. They will pull aside a student who leaves the dining room table messy or makes a mean comment. They pause and look into the weeping eyes of a child to listen about the grandmother they lost. They linger in offices waiting to give extra help. They drop everything when a student says, "Can I talk with you for a minute?" So this, my mother showed me, that to teach is to believe we are charged to bring our deepest empathy, our fullest compassion, and our profound commitment to touching the hearts of the students. And I hope that in some small way, you saw that when you walked the halls of the school. But I want to complete the story and to point to the other quality, I think, of a great school, and that is the ability to enlighten, to bring light. And that means I have to talk about my father. And he showed me that a great school teaches students how to think. And while that sounds easy, it's not as easy as you think. So in those same years that my mother was at Yale, my father, Emeritus Dunham Professor of History, who's still alive and still writing, he was a Roman historian and chair of the department. He has simply the most brilliant and capacious mind that I've ever known. And I say with bias and love that he's one of the most important ancient historians the world has ever known. That's not just me. In 2001, the American Historical Association gave him a kind of lifetime achievement award. It's called the Award for Scholarship Distinction, noting that he was, and I quote, "the greatest historian of the Roman Empire alive today." I always wanted to be 1/10 of the intellect he was. And he was destined to become a professor. He was a brilliant student at Exeter and then Harvard, where he graduated summa cum laude. He spent a couple summers on archaeological digs around the Mediterranean, and then after professorships at the University of Oregon and Brandeis, with fellowships from Fulbright and Guggenheim, he came to Yale, and from 1967 to 1993, he was, among many bright lights, one of the brightest. His output as a scholar was incredible and staggering, and it never slowed. Scores of scholarly articles, some 20 books, if my count is correct, half of them written in what was technically but not really his retirement. He speaks or writes with varying degrees of command: German, Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, Italian, perhaps some others I've forgotten. And I've never met anyone with as daunting and massive an intellect, and more importantly, with as deep a love of learning. He needed to ask the great questions the way you and I need to breathe. And his answers, inevitably, were illuminating, and they threw light onto some of the most dimly lit and poorly understood parts of human history. So if my mother's passion for contact shaped my philosophy, so too did my father's commitment to scholarship, to his belief that learning was gloriously fun and deeply rewarding, that intellectual enlightenment could become a life's purpose, and that a school or university was where we might learn how to think. Now, as a boy, another story, I often woke up early on weekends to go play, maybe go fishing on Long Island Sound or riding bikes in the neighborhood with the kids. And I would sometimes creep downstairs, thinking I was the first one awake. But often I saw my father, and he would be sitting in a chair in the living room in the semi-darkness with a light over his shoulder, and he was reading and taking notes on a clipboard on yellow legal pad, dabbing liquid paper over the mistakes. There was as well, I think years later, an old Olivetti typewriter with these clacking and stubborn keys, and then later the glowing Apple IIe. But that was just technology. The real presence in the room was his mind. And usually he would be wearing a sensible, lumpy wool sweater, sipping tea. Sometimes there was a banana peel or a bowl of cereal next to him. And to this day, I have no idea how often he woke early. But there was certainly something monastic about his scholarship. His search for historical truth was relentless. And it was not as if I just got to walk out and play and got off easy. I might ask, as a 12-year-old would, "What you reading, Dad?" And then he might answer something like, "Will, do you think Rome really became Christian the way we think it was?" Now, let me be clear. This was neither an easy nor popular line of inquiry, and that question later became a book that really shook the corner of his world. But that's how my day might begin. And understand, the question was not rhetorical. He expected an answer. And when I ventured a response, he might counter, "You need to define your terms." I think I was the only 12-year-old in the country who was told to define his terms at 5 in the morning. And I would say that if this was the challenge a boy got, imagine the graduate student or undergrad. I know a long-tenured professor at one of the great public universities in the land who had my father when he was a graduate student I guess it's now about 60 years ago. I am pretty confident he would say that my father was his most important professional mentor. And he told me once that the first essay he wrote, which he now realizes was written with this incredibly impoverished handful of sources, came back with the word "wrong" written up and down the margins. But it also included a list of books that my father said he needed to read before his next paper, and it had an invitation to come by the office. And with that, his road to a PhD was beginning to be paved. And my father was and is a beautifully warm and caring man, but you had better feel prepared to be challenged. I'm pretty sure that he felt that our best learning came from going to places where we were not comfortable. He stress-tested centuries-old accepted truths. He challenged assertions and then made you defend them. In other words, he taught students how to think. And above all, he showed me that great teachers were perpetually showing the value and joy of asking great questions. Intellectual enlightenment was possible, but he thought it came only if we had the courage and the tenacity to ask these questions. So here's another story, a blurred memory. I don't remember. I'm guessing I was 14 or 15. There was a Sunday when he and I were doing some yard work, and we were taking a break, just leaning on our rakes. And the day before, we had watched a football game at the Yale Bowl. And he began thinking out loud, as he often did, this time about the nature of democracy in Rome. This was a break from raking. He said, "I was thinking about halftime at the game and about how everyone went to the restroom and there were long lines. Now, we know that who votes and how often they vote says a lot about democracy." You're wondering where this is going. Now, we have plans of municipal buildings in Rome, and indeed some intact ruins, and we know what those public buildings look like. Maybe we should look at bathrooms. After all, if it was only men voting and thousands were coming into Rome to vote, just like yesterday's game, you'd think they'd have to provide enough urinals. Now, who thinks like that? No one was asking questions like that in this field. He was doing what's called social history long before it became fashionable. And as with all great scholars, it was when he challenged those assumptions, right, when he rattled the cage of history, that he made his greatest contributions to his field. And sample titles of his books may or may not surprise you. They include things like Christianizing the Roman Empire, The Earliest Romans, a character sketch, Christianity and Paganism in the 4th to 8th centuries, Corruption and Decline in Rome. I could go on with another 15. So I was observing in real time at that moment the most extraordinary mind at work, a model of what we might aspire to in our work as teachers. So if I have a philosophy of education, of what a school must do for growth, into a large part it comes from him. And so from him, and I hope this you saw in the school, from him comes my conviction that we need to find teachers with an absolute passion for their academic discipline, true scholars who never tire of learning. From him came the belief, as I've said, that learning how to think required discomfort, that being challenged to reflect on and defend your thinking was essential to enlightenment. I hope you saw that in class. Challenged to reflect on and defend your thinking. From him came the belief that this phrase I use, stress testing of assumptions, especially the ones that have been long held and commonly accepted, was critical. From him I came to see, obviously, the value of the good question, that an intellectual community like this one was one where all citizens were engaged in questioning at all times. From him I came to see the idea that a robust, informed, and researched perspective was absolutely necessary for valuable exchange. And from him I saw that an openness to new ideas, to having your mind changed, being willing to be changed, was necessary and essential to being a scholar. So this my father showed me, and it has shaped how I think about schools, that to teach is to stretch the intellect. It's to ask the hardest questions, to test assumptions, to be open to change, to actively seek discomfort, and therefore to enlighten the mind. And could there be a better gift? So now you see where I come from. You see as well what I've hoped for this school, that for your students, your children, it would touch and it would enlighten. And as I get older, and I think and more reflective perhaps, I begin to understand that perhaps in some way I've simply been trying to live out through a school what my mother and my father, my two greatest heroes, showed me. For the past 39 years, I've felt them both every day here, and now you've met them. Perhaps in the end, that's all a school seeks, touch and light. It's a beautiful aspiration, and I hope that's the school you saw today and the one that I hope we will always be. If it was, it has little to do with me. It has all to do with the remarkable teachers on this campus and the two who are not. So maybe the task of a school, maybe, it's like that moment when you put binoculars to your eyes, and for a moment you see two things, sharp but separate, and then you twist the lens and you turn the knob, and they come together suddenly with this perfect and awesome clarity. So that's what I'm getting at, I think. That how a school brings together two aspirations, touch and light. And if we work hard, and if we can stay humble, and remain stalwart, and have faith, they become one. And when that happens, you can see a long way and clearly. So it's with that thought and my gratitude and happiness that we're all together in a way we've not been able to for 2 years. I welcome you to Taft. I thank you for everything you do, and I hope you have a great day today. So thank you.